Chapter 5, Carbohydrates, Screencast 4. Now, the next two screencasts are going to be focusing on health concerns that are related to diabetes. Now, what we do know that an adequate intake of carbohydrate is especially important for maintaining our normal health and also decreasing the risk of chronic diseases. But remember, you can get too much of a good thing, and excessive intake of carbohydrates can result in some other issues that can greatly impact our overall health. The first one we want to look at are those very high fiber diets. We're now looking at diets that have above 50 to 60 grams per day, and these are some of the health risks that are associated with this. One of the results of eating a high fiber diet will be hard and dry stools, especially if fluid intake is low. Now, prolonged, this is going to result in hemorrhoids, rectal bleeding, and if it continues and persists, it may actually result in intestinal blockage that needs to be surgically repaired. Another thing potentially associated with a high fiber diet is the impact on the absorption of minerals, because some minerals such as zinc and iron can actually bind to the fiber, and if it's bound to the fiber, your body's not going to be able to use it, and that results in increasing the risk for deficiencies. And when we look at iron, iron is already a fairly significant deficiency across the world. Now, when we look at young children, there are also some special concerns here, and we're going to be looking primarily at young children, the elderly, and individuals that are malnourished. We're specifically addressing a population that has problem getting enough food and nutrients to begin with. If they happen to be on one of these very high fiber diets, what the high fiber is going to do is create a sense of fullness, and that's going to reduce the overall intake of foods, and that is the problem associated with that. If we look at high sugar diets, this tends to be more of an issue. And there is an especial concern here for children and adolescents, because when we look at high sugar diets, we're probably talking primarily about added sugars. And this results in a significant increase in empty calories, because that's really what added sugars are. And so let's think about a 20-ounce soda. Okay? That is now the standard. The original serving of a soft drink with sugar was anywhere from 6.5 to 8 ounces. Think about that. It's now 20. And if someone was to consume a 20-ounce sugary soda every day, on its own, that's about 62,000 calories over the entire year, and that can potentially result in a 17-pound increase in body weight. That's significant, and that is just by having one 20-ounce sugar a day. Okay, that's it. And so the risk it has on weight gain and obesity due to this extra energy intake is significant, because it's going to increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. Other things that we're going to be associated with these high sugar diets are going to see an increased levels of triglycerides, low density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol, a decrease in the levels of HDL or high density lipoprotein cholesterol, and that's the good cholesterol. We're also looking at a potential of increasing the risk for type 2 diabetes that has been associated with sugar. One thing that I do want to point out, the fact that a high sugar intake in children will result in hyperactivity, there's actually no scientific evidence that supports that finding. So there's no evidence there. So increased sugar intake in children do not cause hyperactivity. Probably one of the more obvious conditions associated with a high sugar diet is going to be dental caries. The bacteria that we have in our mouth actually metabolize the sugar, and it converts it into an acid. And then that acid is responsible for actually dissolving our tooth enamel. Now, Another condition is lactose intolerance. Now, lactose intolerance is due to a decreased production of lactase. That is the enzyme responsible for breaking down lactose, and that starts to decrease after early childhood. Now, there's two different types of lactose intolerance. The first is known as primary lactose intolerance, and that is flat out insufficiency of lactase production. Now, the symptoms that are associated with individuals that have this type of lactose intolerance, there's going to be abdominal pain. You're going to look at bloating, okay? Gas, diarrhea, because what the sugar does, it pulls water into the large intestine, resulting in diarrhea. Now, the amount of a lactose tolerance varies by individuals, but what we do know, there are some foods that are easily more tolerated by those that have primary lactose intolerance. Examples would be hard cheeses, yogurt, and acidophilus milk. So those are more easily tolerated. Now, secondary lactose intolerance, there's something else going on that's actually damaging the cells of the small intestine that produce lactase. For example, Crohn's disease can specifically damage these cells, and also severe diarrhea. So those are situations that may cause this secondary lactose intolerance, and this is generally more of a temporary nature. Now, when we look at glucose intolerance, really what we have here is an abnormal regulation of blood glucose levels. And typically we're going to see two different types. One is going to be hyperglycemia, and that's the most common. We're looking at individuals that have high blood glucose levels, and this is especially noted with individuals that have diabetes mellitus and metabolic syndrome. At the opposite end of the spectrum is going to be hypoglycemia, and this is a low blood glucose level. Now, normal fasting blood glucose levels fall within the range of 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. Above 126 milligrams per deciliter is the cutoff that they use to classify someone as diabetic. And if we look at some of the symptoms that are associated with this, we see hunger, we see thirst, there's frequent urination, and weight loss. In those individuals that have hypoglycemia, some of the symptoms are similar. We're going to see hunger, we're going to see shakiness, irritability, weakness, and headache. Remember, the central nervous system is highly dependent upon the availability of glucose, and if you are hypoglycemic, that is definitely going to impact central nervous system function. Now, the liver and pancreas are the two organs that are primarily responsible for regulating blood glucose. What the liver does, it actually determines after a meal the amount of glucose that is going to enter the bloodstream, and it's also going to determine how much of that glucose is actually going to be stored as glycogen. So that is all controlled by the liver. Now, when we talk about the pancreas, we're now talking about the endocrine pancreas. The pancreas secretes two hormones, insulin and glucagon. We're going to go into a little bit more detail here. Insulin is responsible for lowering blood glucose. Glucagon is responsible for increasing blood glucose. So they're an antagonistic pair. Now, as noted, insulin is released after eating, especially when blood glucose levels are high, and that's what we see then. The release of insulin is going to result in an increased uptake of glucose by cells, using glucose as energy, and this is one of the things that we see that basically is responsible for these low-carb diets. Insulin is actually a storage hormone. So now we're going to store this excess glucose. Ideally, it's going to be stored as glycogen, but remember, we have limited capacity to store glucose as glycogen, and if that's the case, and we already have full glycogen storage, we're going to store that excess glucose, and it's going to become fat. So overall, insulin is responsible for lowering blood glucose. Glucagon, this is going to be released if no dietary carbohydrates are present and blood glucose levels have fallen. Now, glucagon is going to promote the breakdown of glycogen to make glucose available, and it's also going to promote the process of gluconeogenesis. And this is the liver actually producing glucose, and it's actually going to produce that glucose from the carbon skeleton of some amino acids. So now you're looking at protein, breaking down the amino acids and the building blocks in protein so that the body can have adequate levels of glucose. Two other hormones also, epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're going to trigger gluconeogenesis and also increase the availability of glucose in the bloodstream. Cortisol and growth hormone, what they're going to do is decrease the amount of glucose that's being used by cells, so that glucose can actually be moved into the bloodstream to be used there also. Now, I want to spend some time talking about this particular figure here because it's really important. So what we have here is the normal range, okay? And so notice we can think of this as a set point, and we're really looking at two different negative feedback mechanisms that come into play. One, when glucose levels are too high, and the other when glucose levels are low. So let's kind of take a look at what's going on here. So the first thing that we're going to see, and this is very common after a meal. So notice we're going to see a relatively large increase in circulating levels of blood glucose. That's going to stimulate the pancreas to release insulin. Now, that insulin is going to do one of two things. It's going to take that glucose and move it into cells, or that glucose is going to be converted into glycogen. But remember, we have limited capacity to store glycogen, and any excess glucose beyond that, our body is going to store as fat. So this will basically bring those glucose levels back down. Okay? So now let's kind of look at the opposite. So now we're looking at what happens when blood glucose levels are too low. The pancreas will release glucagon. This is going to break down glycogen, so glucose is released, and it's also going to result in producing new glucose or gluconeogenesis. And once again, the hope here is to normalize blood glucose. That's the overall goal of both of these hormones, to respond when there's abnormally high or abnormally low levels of glucose. Hopefully these mechanisms will bring those glucose levels back to normal. Perfect example of negative feedback mechanisms. Now here we're looking at the overall impact that other hormones have in the regulation of blood glucose. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here looking at insulin and glucagon because I think they're fairly straightforward. So let's look at epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are primarily associated with the fight or flight response. So the target is going to be liver and muscle. And what's happening here, epinephrine, norepinephrine, think about fight or flight. There's going to be increased energy requirement to sustain the heightened alertness and things that are associated with sympathetic drive. So this is going to stimulate the increased breakdown of glycogen and the release of glucose by the liver. And we're also going to see more gluconeogenesis, and the overall effect is to increase blood glucose. Cortisol, another hormone coming from the adrenal glands, is going to impact liver and muscle. This also will increase gluconeogenesis by the liver. It's also going to decrease the use of glucose by muscle and other organs, and the overall impact is an increase in blood glucose. Growth hormone, which comes from the pituitary gland, the target here is going to be liver, muscle, and adipose tissue. So we got a new one here. So this is going to decrease glucose uptake by muscle, and it's also going to increase the mobilization of free fatty acids, and we're also going to see increased glucose output by the liver. And notice what they're all doing, okay? 4 of these hormones increase blood glucose, and the only hormone that decreases blood glucose is going to be insulin. Now, you may have heard of something known as metabolic syndrome or syndrome X. What we're looking at here are a group of factors that significantly increase the risk of a person developing type 2 diabetes or some form of cardiovascular disease. Now, the factors that make up metabolic syndrome, so you have to demonstrate a number of these to be considered to have metabolic syndrome. You have insulin resistance, and what that means, the insulin is there, but it's not impacting or lowering blood glucose. Abdominal obesity, high blood triglycerides and low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, low levels of the good cholesterol. You're going to be looking at high blood pressure, an increase in proteins associated with the inflammatory process, and also these higher concentrations of oxidized LDL cholesterol. And that's something we're going to be looking at, especially in the next chapter, chapter 6, which is focusing on lipids. Now, to be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, you need to present 3 or more of the previous criteria. Now, other things that they're looking at here is a waist circumference greater, than 35 inches for women or 40 for men, fasting triglycerides above 150 milligrams per deciliter, HDL cholesterol levels below 40 for men, below 50 for women, elevated blood pressure, and fasting blood glucose levels that are above 110 milligrams per deciliter. So that's generally what is used to classify or diagnose an individual with metabolic syndrome. So 3 or more of these criteria. Now, hypoglycemia, this is something that can occur in individuals with or without diabetes. In the diabetic, it can be caused by not getting enough or getting too much insulin. It can be caused by not eating frequently enough or exercising without eating carbohydrates. So all of this is going to result in the potential for very low levels of blood glucose. In the non-diabetic, 2 types are generally possible. There's a reactive hypoglycemia, and this could be, for some reason, excuse me, an exaggerated insulin response after eating, or it's also common in individuals that fast. So you can expect low blood glucose levels after an individual is fasting for 8 hours. Now, when we're looking at diabetes and the clinical perspective here, really when we start to see fasting blood glucose levels at or above 126 milligrams per deciliter. One of the factors that they also look at when you have a blood panel done, they're going to look at hemoglobin A1C. When this actually is above 6.5%, that is also used to diagnose an individual with diabetes. Now, we're talking about diabetes mellitus. Okay, so you need to make sure that that's the diabetes we're talking about, because there's also diabetes insipidus, which has nothing to do with blood glucose regulation. The 2 forms of diabetes are type 1, which is insulin dependent, and then type 2, which is not dependent upon insulin. So really the type 1 diabetic, they're not producing insulin, and the type 2 diabetic, they're producing insulin, but that insulin is not effective in regulating blood glucose. There's also gestational diabetes, and there's some women that actually develop diabetes during pregnancy. Generally, this resolves after the pregnancy, but there is evidence that this does lead to a greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes later down the road.